The Abbasid Caliphate. There are three main periods of Abbasid rule. We have this first Abbasid period, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about now. But in this first Abbasid period, 750 to 861, you have great growth and prosperity. And this is the period that is known to many as the Golden Age of Islam. And it's the Golden Age because, one, the Abbasids ruled extremely well. One of the reasons that they ruled extremely well is because, in a sense, they took the best of Byzantine administration practices and the best of Sassanid administrative practices and put them together into a kind of a unique ruling formula. The other thing is they also had plenty of wealth. There were incredible technologies that developed at this time, some things that we might take for granted, but paper. I mean, this is where really the technologies of paper are developed incredibly rapidly. And then all of the knowledge that's coming in from all of these different parts, from the Persian Empire, from the Byzantine Empire, from India, it all gets put together. And so you have incredible developments in mathematics, incredible developments in physics, incredible developments in literature, and in many other fields at this time. Now, you then have a period of decline. It's the beginning of political decline. The Abbasids are still, for the most part, they're somewhat in control, but 861 to 1055 is a period when all of the lands that are under Islamic rule are no longer fully ruled by the Abbasids. And they start to develop these other groups. Some of them will continue to read the khutbah in the name of the Abbasid Caliph. So they acknowledge the Abbasid Caliph. Some of them are even giving taxes to the Abbasids. But the Abbasids don't have complete political rule, and you actually have the rise of Shiite dynasties at this time. All right, and then you have the third Abbasid period. All right, the Abbasids continued to wield some political power, but they are really reduced to figureheads by various sultanates. And this, as we're going to see, becomes a very important word in the political conceptualization of Islam. All right? But, so what does this mean? Actually, in 1055, in this time, actually, the Seljuks, we're going to look at in a few minutes, they come to power, and when they take over Baghdad, they go in, they take the Abbasid Caliph out of his palace, take him away, and then they take him back to his palace. And they say, we're going to continue to read the khutbah in your name, but just so you know, we can take you away anytime we want, all right? So in a sense, because of the religious significance of the Abbasid Caliphate in the eyes of Muslims, it serves well for these other dynasties to keep them in power. But they're not the ones who are really running the show anymore. And that's what you have from this period of 1055 to 1258. 1258 is the sack of Baghdad by the Mongols, and it really does abolish the caliphate as we know it. There continue to be kind of figurehead Abbasid caliphs that are seated in Cairo under various dynasties, under the Mamluks up until the year 1517, but they're really what you could almost call shadow caliphs, and that's where it really is just for purposes of claiming religious legitimacy, and they don't really wield any political power.
Can you just clarify, can you go back to a map of the sort of the extent of that caliphate or empire? So when I've been talking to my students about this, I mean, there's got to be there's people in these regions that are living in great isolation, that are not really contacting day to day with members of this empire, this power. And one of the things I've taught my students is that people did convert because of lesser taxes, or my understanding is that if you were enslaved and you converted, you could be freed.
It could get you closer to it, we wouldn't necessarily.
And then there would also be Christians and Jews that were living in these regions as well. So when we talk about this being their empire, or this being, so when you say under the control, it's under the economic control, under the political and military control, or how would you,
It's
how
an
do you
excellent-
define the control?
We're about to get into that a little bit more. So what we could say here is that basically one of the basic ways to define the control is in whose name is the khutbah read? In whose name is the Friday prayer read?
Okay.
That's one of the simplest ways to say, okay, so here, and we'll see in a minute that actually, like, for example, right here, in these areas, there were other groups that rose that were known as the Samanids, the Ghaznavids, and others that rose up here that were basically independent. And they paid some homage to the Abbasid Caliph, but they were basically, for the most part, independent. And actually, even in here, we're about to see the Fatimid dynasty rose up. That was its own, basically, rival caliphate. All right. Now, for all of that to have happened, means that already some of these places had to have been somewhat nominally under Abbasid rule, and it shows you that to rule all of this area militarily and keep it under control is almost impossible. So, I mean, for example, Spain is basically independent of the Abbasids and ruled basically independently. And some of these places, like you get up into these areas and Samarkand and stuff, it's governed basically independently. So in terms of governing things, they pay a little bit of taxes. That they weren't paying the exact amount that they were getting to the caliph, and they read the khutbah in the caliph's name. And it's kind of, we're going to agree to disagree about other things, and we'll just keep this.
And would they leave local like administrators kind of in charge?
Yeah, I mean that's it. They would leave the. Here, I'm going to get into this. We're going to go here, and I'll show you some of these other dynasties. All right, in just a minute. It's a very good question about exactly. I mean, the amount of control that they actually were able to maintain for some time was incredibly important. All right, so let me just go through this, and then I'm going to show you some of the dynasties that rose up as Abbasid power came down, and that's why we say that the real period of strong Abbasid rule, although they last till 1258, is really only till 861. And it's around 861 that you start having these outlying regions really express their independence.
Okay.
All right.
We often paint it in contrast to what's going on in Europe, which is very, like you've got the Franks, you've got the Germanic tribes, and it's pretty isolated and pretty dark, although people question that term now.
Yeah.
But this is this is a much larger area that's being controlled as opposed to...
It's a decentralized centralization.
Okay, that's a good way to talk about it.
Yeah, so you've got, and this is actually, in part, it's part of the genius of the Abbasid rule, is that whereas the Umayyads really felt like they had to clamp down and keep control, and this upset people, and they had to be governing things, the Abbasids kind of were able to allow semi-independence to some of the outlying regions, and just say, look, you guys are out there, things are going fine here. You can have your little Ghaznavid groups over here, your Samanid group over here, your Tulunids and other groups that we're about to see. Okay. All right? Now, as I said before, under al-Mansur, you have the real kind of consolidation of Abbasid rule. Al-Mansur managed the finances of the empire incredibly well. And I would really actually say that his financial management is part of what led to the continuing power of the Abbasids, up through 861 and even beyond, because his successors had all kinds of money to play with. Now, Haroon Rashid is probably the most famous of all of the Abbasid caliphs. One of the reasons that he's the most famous of all of the Abbasid caliphs is because he appears in Alf Layla wa Layla, in the 1001 Nights, which was actually, Alf Layla wa Layla is an amazing it's really kind of a rolling set of stories that gradually picked up new stories as it went from one region to another. And it started kind of in Iran, and it rolled through, and these stories were added, and stories from the ancient Arab past were added in, and then stories of Haroon Rashid were added in, and then later on it gets written down later in the Abbasid period. But
is it like fan fiction?
Yeah, I mean, it's like fan fiction. This is where you get Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. This is where you get Sindbad. This is where you get Aladdin, and these things. But then, yeah, Haroon Rashid. There's a lot of hagiography for Haroon Rashid, and this is one of the things that the Abbasids also did. Is that notice these names? Al-Mansur. It's a religious name. It means the one who is helped by God. Al-Mahdi means the guide. Al-Hadi, another one for the guide. Haroon, Aaron. Ar-Rashid, the one who is guided, who is rightly led. They put these religious names onto their and so they have these religious titles. And so they were very conscientious about establishing this hagiography for themselves. And that's why everybody felt that they had to read in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in these other regions. Now, Haroon al-Rashid did, however, do something that led to the beginning of the decline of consolidated Abbasid rule, which is he divided his empire between his two sons, Al-Amin and Al-Ma'mun. Al-Amin, the territories that he only ruled for 4 years because, well, under somewhat mysterious circumstances, he died. And Al-Ma'mun came to power. And Al-Ma'mun is particularly important because he is the one who continued some of the policies that were begun by Haroon al-Rashid, but about bringing knowledge, funding knowledge. This is a time, as a scholar, if there's any period in which I would have liked to have lived, it is this period in Baghdad. If you were to translate a book, a translator would be something around the equivalent of $250,000 to $300 a year. Good money to translate books. This is the period in which all of the philosophy from the Greeks is being translated into Arabic. Some of it's being translated from Syriac, but eventually they said, no, we should translate it all from the original sources. And so they're translating this into Arabic. It lends to an incredible intellectual culture at this time because you also have knowledge coming from India and certain theories of mathematics that are coming, kind of more theoretical mathematical structures coming from the Greeks being combined with more precise mathematical structures coming from the Indians. And there's this problem that Muslims have, which is they've got to pray in the right direction and they've got to pray at the right time. So all of this mathematical knowledge that's coming from around is being put to use of, well, how do we actually determine the direction of prayer? I mean, when you look at some of trigonometry, some of trigonometry actually comes with how do you figure out the time of the afternoon prayer. You actually have to develop cosine and tangent in order to be able to answer the question of what time is your late afternoon prayer if you're living anywhere north of Damascus. Or actually, I would say even Damascus and north from there, because of the way in which the Earth's curvature changes the time of the thing. When you're living down near the equator, the time at which the prayer comes is the time at which the shadow is the same length as the object. Pretty simple when you're living at the equator, all right? But then when you get up north, your shadow is... Abu Rauf, you're from the Netherlands, right? Where are you from, Abu Rauf? Belgium. Oh, you're from Belgium. Sorry. Well, even Belgium. I mean, even Belgium and France. You're talking. Your shadow during the winter is always twice as long as the object. So you can't use these standards anymore. So these are some of the things that go into the developments and some of the questions that are being asked. So here you have knowledge under the Abbasids. You can see that you've got the knowledge from Athens, from Beyonce, knowledge from all of these areas that have become, like Edessa had become a location of Greek learning, and of course Alexandria and Damascus, and all of these things come to Baghdad, all right? And Baghdad really becomes, you could say, the intellectual capital of the world. And scholars, they want to go there for two things. Well, that's where you're going to have the interesting discourse. It's where you're going to get paid. All right? If you want to prove yourself as a scholar, you go to Baghdad. So all of this knowledge is coming in, all of Plotinus, all of Plato, Aristotle, and the Neoplatonic thought that developed after that in Greek. It's all being translated. It completely changes Islamic theology. It develops the tradition of Islamic philosophy that really starts at this time. Here are a few of the important names. Hunayn bin Ishaq was probably the most important translator at this time. Al-Khwarizmi, who is said to be the father of algebra. I mean, very basically, simply said that, well, we can do math in reverse. And which was kind of, people knew you could do it before, but he was the first one to kind of systematize the process by which we do math, in a sense, in reverse. And so that's where we actually get the word for algorithm. Algorithm is actually taken from the name Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Kindi is the first Arab philosopher and the first, really the first Muslim philosopher at the time. Al-Farabi. You cannot overestimate the influence of Abu Nasr al-Farabi in the history of philosophy. For example, Maimonides wrote of him, said that his works are without peer and that they are all flawless. And I believe that when you're talking about the Renaissance, you spoke about Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd also basically was deeply influenced. I mean, he argued he wanted to take out the Neoplatonic influences that he thought were in al-Farabi. Nonetheless, every philosopher that did philosophy either in the Arab world or actually even in the Latin West was influenced by al-Farabi. And this man was an incredible genius. All right, so now here's the influence of Baghdad. You go here, you could take that. The philosophy from Baghdad, of course, as we know, went to Tunisia, and went here up into the Iberian Peninsula, of course, into Andalusia, and spread through all of these different means. Of course, it was incorporated in Istanbul, all of these different means throughout here. We should also actually write an arrow going from here to Isfahan, because there was the philosophy that was developed in this area eventually then was later developed in Isfahan, but we're not going to get into that now. But then the philosophy from Isfahan came and influenced other parts of the world. But this just gives you an idea of how science and knowledge really traveled from Baghdad throughout the world. And one of the things that comes into play here, one cannot overestimate the importance of having just a minute, Megan, cannot overestimate the importance of having a single language that unifies this region. We're talking from all the way over here to all the way over here. There is a single intellectual language that is used and is spoken. To give you an idea of how significant this is, German and English are said to have come from the same language originally, and that they divided from one another some 500 to 600 years ago, and we don't have that original language. Whereas all of the dialects of Arabic that you have, we can still trace their original language, and we still have a situation where a person, an intellectual in Baghdad, can have a discourse with an intellectual in Fez, Morocco, and even that intellectual in Baghdad can have a discourse with an intellectual in Iran. When I went to Iran, for example, I know some Persian, but I actually would speak with all of the scholars in Arabic. And if you go to Indonesia today, as a Muslim scholar, I could go and I could speak with Indonesian scholars in Arabic. And so this actual function of Arabic as the language of international intellectual discourse among Muslims, it was really kind of consolidated in Baghdad at this time. It was, of course, done under the Umayyads, but for it to become intellectual discourse, this is the great contribution of Baghdad. This is the great contribution of the Abbasids.